Hello, and welcome once again to Frankly. Today I aim to explain to you how we came to be in the state that we're in, the modern condition of the tragedy of errors, wherewith the Vatican and other branches of Christianity seem to have neglected Christ and the teachings of the Church entirely in favour of the preaching of the political beliefs of liberalism. In the last video, I tried to explain to you how liberal democracy was a marketing term for the rule by an elite that would condition the public masses through the manipulation of public opinion in order to replace everything with itself: your culture, traditions, history, your beliefs, your ideas about reality, and of course, your religion. People like John Dewey, who wrote A Common Faith in the mid-1930s, explicitly intended to replace Christ in Christianity with the political beliefs of the liberal elite. How is this done? I also explained to some degree in the last video that his co-founder of the Council on Foreign Relations, Walter Lippmann, was a genius of propaganda, and he would use this genius to manufacture consent for the liberal system, which was instituted after the old European, largely Catholic monarchical order was swept away in the First World War. Today we will explore how the grand illusion of liberal democracy supplied political liberal beliefs in place of Christ. I'm going to go back to the 19th century, to around the 1860s, to try and explain to you where this idea came from and who came up with the notion that the new, liberalised and increasingly democratic world required the supply of the liberal idea of culture to unify it. Of course, formerly, this was known as Christendom. But if we are to democratise and liberalise, we must do away with Christ, of course, according to thinkers like Matthew Arnold, who came up with this thesis in his book in the mid-1860s called Culture and Anarchy. Matthew Arnold foresaw that the West would be increasingly liberalised and democratised. He feared that this would lead to anarchy, and his solution was the supply of what liberals like him understood as culture. This is the beginning of the idea, the formalised idea which would be made into policy and realised by people like John Dewey and Walter Lippmann, that you can replace Christ at the centre of religion but retain all of its external structures and all of its, or even some of its practices. But at the centre of it, what you're preaching is the political beliefs of liberalism as if they were religions. This has been noted with the fervent preaching of the so-called climate emergency and the net zero cult from the Vatican, as if it were a matter of moral theology. Similarly, the rainbow flag is displayed, and so is the celebration of open borders, effectively a partnership with an international human trafficking system occasioned by a series of endless wars. Obviously, there is no wider moral dimension to this, and it only makes sense if you believe in the liberal utopia that all these things are supposed to produce. So this is how we ended up with a situation where the Catholic Church in its synodal form and modern forms of Christianity preach ABC, anything but Christ, and in fact simply echo the agenda of the ruling liberal elite. Wake up, Walter. Wake up. This is why there's no place like home. Wake up. The liberal democratic project was there to replace everything that you knew with a placeless, international nowhere land. Walter, wake up. You can see why Walter wishes to spend what he laughingly refers to as his life in a kind of digitally induced stupor. You can be forgiven for not wanting to know the terrible truth about things. But if you look into things called books, like this one, Culture and Anarchy, by Matthew Arnold, and indeed this excellent treatment of T.S. Eliot's rebuttal of it by James Matthew Wilson, also called Culture and Anarchy, then you could understand where these things come from. The purpose of what I'm telling you today is that these things were done by men. This is not some kind of force of nature. The state we are in did not simply happen as the result of some progress or some Hegelian idea of the resolution of the spirit of the world. These were decisions taken by men, and Matthew Arnold's inspirational view was adopted by the new managerial structure of the new liberal idea, which produced liberal democracy, the manufacture of mass belief in itself to replace everything with itself. In Culture and Anarchy, Matthew Arnold fondly imagined that the masses could be supplied with things like classical music and poetry to nourish and guide them spiritually through his humanistic vision of a democratized liberal utopia. The shortcomings of this are obvious. Now, it's difficult not to go on about T.S. Eliot. I love T.S. Eliot, and, in fact, I suppose I'm coming to resemble him somewhat. Maybe if I put on my intellectual spectacles, I shall resemble him more so. Walter, do please put up a fitting picture of Thomas Stearns Eliot. Of course, it would be unseemly to make a spectacle of myself when mentioning such an august figure, but T.S. Eliot wrote a book in 1936, I think, which was called Notes Towards the Definition of Culture. In it, he said many interesting things. One thing which he said, which would be markedly interesting to anyone interested in the Catholic Church today, is that you simply cannot replace one thing with another and expect them to be the same, because they're different. Eliot was objecting to Matthew Arnold's idea that liberals could supply their idea of culture in place of Christ, and that things would function just as well. This is because of the basic fact of difference. Of course, culture, however high or low, is not the same as Christ. If you replace Christ with culture, the result is not the same. A parallel could be drawn with the emerging new religion of the synodal project in the Vatican today. We are told, of course, that this new thing is the same as the true thing, when it patently is not. Eliot's distinction for such a well-read and brilliant man is remarkable, because it states the obvious, and it states it in a way that makes complex ideas immediately simple, and you realise when you read that, why didn't I see that before? Of course, that's true. Eliot's point is that you can't simply swap one thing out for another, as Matthew Arnold proposed. Why then did the Liberal Democratic Project, under the aegis of people like John Dewey and Walter Lippmann, why did they adopt this notion? Well, that's because the point of the Liberal Democratic Project is to replace our entire civilization with itself. This is the reason why I often refer to liberal democracy as a grand illusion. It uses the techniques, increasingly refined over a century, of modern mass communications and propaganda to form in the minds of the public an image of reality which can be manipulated by those who control its means of production. This is your culture under the Liberal Democratic Project, your news, television, films, entertainment, comedy, books, talking heads, and so-called literature and art. All of these forms have been documented in a book by Francis Stoner Saunders called Who Pays the Piper, to have been directly sponsored by the CIA after the Second World War to propagandise the liberal system at home and abroad. In short, most of our mass culture is a message from its sponsors. You can see how this attempt to achieve a kind of totalitarian control over the very nature of being and your sense of reality and yourself would be somewhat hampered if people continued to believe in Christ and the traditional doctrines of the Catholic Church. Because of course, at the time that Matthew Arnold was writing Culture and Anarchy, this was around the same time that Pope Pius IX produced his Syllabus of Errors. This is an excellent guide of around 80 points of modernist doctrine, which have now become the political religion of our times. You can read it yourself, and it's interesting to see that this emerged at the same time that a sort of manifesto for implementing them as the political religious belief of the forthcoming liberal system was being produced by Matthew Arnold. There are currents and countercurrents in the struggle for civilization, and of course I would argue that there is a difference between what we call culture, or what we're compelled to call culture, and civilization itself. Because of course, what is civilization? I think it is most often referred to as the beautiful and the true. Who is the truth? Of course, that is Christ, and everything beautiful indicates God. It is Christ himself who is the initial event of our civilization, and it is Christianity, therefore, that is the basis of our civilization. This revolutionary project of liberal democracy intended to replace all that with itself. And of course, to do so, it had to replace the central mystery of the Christian religion with its own political dogma. Our entire worldview is to be circumscribed by the limitations of liberals. Man has no soul and no higher purpose. He must seek his satisfaction in the culture supplied by liberal democracy, which of course reinforces belief in the idea that the liberal democratic system is the final and perfect utopia, or the ultimate state of humanity, to which there is no reasonable alternative. This explains why liberals are typically rather arrogant. This is a condition that I refer to as liberal chauvinism, wherewith if you disagree with liberals, as Eliot himself pointed out, they either call you a medievalist or a fascist. This is because, of course, they cannot conceive that anyone could disagree with their utopian ideas, and yet, at the basis of it, it is a foolish attempt at a misbegotten substitution. Arnold's chief error was the misguided belief that God can be replaced with entertainment. As we can see in the 20th and 21st century, what we got instead of Matthew Arnold's high cultural dream of the public nourishment of classical music and opera and excellent poetry was moreover a diet of televised sports and Taylor Swift, the public rituals of popular music, the fascinating spectacle of watching foreign millionaires throw and kick balls around. Marvellous. This obviously cannot supply meaning to people, can it? So you see that this attempt to simply substitute popular or mass culture for Christ was always going to be bounded by the limitations of what it can answer. And so where does man's religious impulse go? The interesting thing about the development from Matthew Arnold to John Dewey to today is that the liberal idea has refined its technique of supplying belief and meaning to the masses it rules, and it rules them by the manufacture of these beliefs. It is to be remembered. What it does in effect today is it supplies things like racial grievance or rights-based progressivism or, say, feminism or abortionism or climatism or any form of ism. It supplies these as if they were religious cults themselves, and in fact, if you observe them dispassionately, their believers do behave like zealotic fanatics. If you contradict them or question their narratives, you are treated like a political heretic. Again, political heresy was a term coined by Walter Lippmann in 1919. And remember, he was one of the chief architects of the liberal democratic system, which he helped to set up by co-founding the Council on Foreign Relations. I will speak to you of that nefarious institution later, which has been described to me by a man who would know, having spent decades as a federal treasury analyst, as simply a front group for the financial interests which proceeded to rulers through a debt-based system, if you like, a permanent living death on credit, serviced by a service economy which reduces to a series of monetized addictions. This, too, is political heresy, to see that this economy of death has become the master of our national fates and indeed the sovereign of our states. The sovereignty of our states, of course, has been delivered to the moneylenders, whilst we are sold these impossible dreams of a utopia on earth to be realised by the fervent and passionate pursuit of the religious, political beliefs of the liberal agenda. What has all this got to do with the church? Obviously, it's a rather big deal if your political system is expressly dedicated to the subtraction of Christ and his replacement with the worship of your ideology. Not only that, but before the liberal system was instituted as liberal democracy, in around 1907, Pope Pius X produced his magnificent Pascendi Dominici Gregis. Pascendi, of course, meaning feeding, and it was termed feeding the flock in English in a convenient subtitle which explains its purpose. It's been also rendered as a catechism on modernism, and this book is one of the most fascinating books I've ever read. People are put off by reading Pascendi because it's so dense and so long and so detailed. So I would recommend you look at Father Lemius's book, A Catechism on Modernism. That returns to you an idea that you're having a conversation with one of the greatest minds that the Catholic Church has produced, a veritable lion of the faith, Pope St. Pius X, and it's a series of questions and answers. It talks about the errors of modernism, their causes, and the final part, their remedies. And, crucially, in the introduction it points out that those who would wish to subvert the Church towards the modernist and liberal agenda exist within it, and indeed some of them were priests. It has been said by Bishop Williamson that what happened when Pope St. Pius X published his resounding condemnation of the errors of modernism, which he called the synthesis of all heresies, that these priests and agents in the Church simply went underground, only to re-emerge in the explosive social revolution of the 1960s, which has produced the synodal spectacle we witness today, has it not? I think that comment, in fact it's probably not the only one, deserves a 3 chili spice warning, Walter, if you would be so kind. If you're still there, have you woken from your stupor? Are you still liberal pilled and democracy maxed? Wake up. This is why there's no place like home. The reason why I make that tasteless joke at Walter's expense is not only because I wish to publicly humiliate him for having made me the subject of various visual jokes in post-production, but also to illustrate a fact that will be obvious when I point it out, is that the Liberal Democratic Project aims to replace everything with itself, of course, but what it's doing so in terms of our environment is making a sort of international nowhere land. You can see its placeless architecture everywhere. You could be anywhere from Austin to Astana in some of these postmodern reflector glass strip-lit shopping mall environments. And you can see that we've come to migrate through a series of sheds for our entire life. We are born in hospital sheds, and we're ushered into educational sheds and then university sheds, to then go and work, as it were, in an email job in an air-conditioned vast industrial shed before we are wheeled into a hospital shed to gracelessly expire whilst plugged into machines and to be studiously ignored by people who have no connection to us whatsoever. The end. This is the utopia as it is seen by a subject of the Liberal Democratic Project in any reasonable urban situation today. It creates an international nowhere land, not just outside you, but within you as well. Because, of course, the central purpose of it is to remove the explanatory power of any competing philosophy or idea, and the supreme competitor to the liberal idea is that of Christ. This is why it is determined to replace him with itself, as with everything else. The reason why I mention Pope St. Pius X is because his encyclical, Pascendi Dominici Gregis, is the most magisterial and comprehensive account of the errors of our time and also how to remedy them. I began this video by telling you that the state we are in, this tragedy of modern errors that we are compelled to call our culture, is not a force of nature. It's not inevitable. It was made by men, and we can undo it. We can replace the near universal evil that it is producing, that it manufactures as belief and monetizes in dependence and addiction economies, with the politics of the common good, as laid out with Pope Leo XIII's Catholic social teaching. We have the remedy in the Catholic Church for this condition. Our decline, socially, into chaos, our total moral collapse, was all prefigured over 100 years ago by the popes who wrote about the condition that they were seeing materialize around them, and that people like Matthew Arnold welcomed, with the remedy of a manufactured liberal culture to unify the belief of the new liberal democratic world. Next time, I will probably explain to you something about the Council on Foreign Relations and how this shady managerial group has been effectively the steering company of liberal democracy. Of course, liberal democracy failed the first time it was instituted, with practically all of them dissolving around a decade after they were instituted, following the violent revolution of the First World War. I'll also go on to explain to you how some of the political religions we see today periodically re-emerge, such as in George Floyd mania, were actually also manufactured through the influence of the Council on Foreign Relations, which has supplied and guided the beliefs of the liberal system for over a century. If you'd like to know a little bit more about what I've been going on about today, you can have a look at my Substack, which shows you modern life as a tragedy of errors and provides a few references for the things that I've brought up today. I'm going to be going on to talk about Pascendi, the encyclical of Pope St. Pius X, in some detail to bring it to a wider audience, because of course it can supply the remedies to the tragedy of our times. God bless you all, and remember, do not despair. If you're thinking of falling into despair, consider my predicament, being trapped in this shed on account of the horrendous digital blackmail that Walter's computer genius has seen him confect through a variety of artificial intelligence systems. He's instructed me to laugh at this point, but I am attempting desperately to remember Morse code in order to blink the message of help. If that's not enough for you, consider Walter's predicament. Consider his station in life. Consider his mind like an oracle spreadsheet of promised satisfactions resolving to a ledger of digital disappointment. Consider also the fact that this terrible liberal system that I've been describing to you is dissolving. The political religion that is now followed by the Vatican is also being rejected across the West. There's a tremendous appetite for truth, for reality, and for beauty. And these things lead in one direction alone, away from the empire of lies and the politics of illusion, and towards Christ himself and his church. I think we can confidently say that even within the space of 2 to 3 years, the celebration of the liberal beliefs as a political religion will seem like an anachronism, akin to watching someone fervently wave the flag of the Soviet Union years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The liberal democratic project and its political religion are running out of time, and the horizon is fast approaching where we can wave goodbye to all that.